And then finally, we've got Art Harrington, who practices environmental and energy law with the law firm of Godfrey Kahn. He is also an adjunct professor of law, teaching an energy law workshop at Marquette Law School. He has the privilege to serve on a number of DNR advisory committees, including the Air Management Study Group that is through the Air Management Program, by appointment by the DNR Secretary. So I'd like to welcome our panelists.
So while Bart is putting this, how many here are from Wisconsin? Okay, I've got a majority of people. Well, I'm the weak link on this panel when I look at my colleagues, and it is a real honor for me to be on this panel with Arlene and Rob and Bart for putting this together. I'm going to talk, we're going from the world, from the Midwest to Wisconsin, and I'm going to focus on fixed sources and the practical implications of this ozone standard. But before I do that, I want to just mention something a little bit about me because it might provide you a little perspective of why I'm talking about this subject. First of all, it's just unbelievable here that we're having this in the University of Wisconsin. I'm a product of this institution. The fact that we have the Nelson Institute here in Wisconsin, and the fact that we have the Energy Center right down the road, and the fact that we're holding this in my view, one of the most beautiful states in North America. I do a lot of biking, a lot of cross-country skiing, and I can tell you, even though I'm practicing in the private sector, the importance of the protective aspects of this, what we're talking about today, is incredibly important to all of us. We all are using this area, and the assets we have in Wisconsin can't be exported, but we can lose them if we don't have good regulation. And we're with the Department of Natural Resources that's got a stellar reputation in the air side. And so I think we're in good hands here with this program, even though there are challenges. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those challenges. A little bit about my practice. It's very varied. I've represented the Forest County Potawatomi on getting their Class 1 airshed up on their reservation, first one since 1992. Very interesting project, working closely with Bart and his staff on getting that implemented. I also do outside environmental consulting and air permitting for the second largest printer in the world, who happens to be headquartered in Wisconsin, that's Quadgraphics. And I've done a lot of air permitting on renewable energy sources, biodigesters, biomass facilities. So I have a perspective here, I think, that is hopefully a little bit more holistic when I talk about some of the implications of this. So what I want to do is, make sure I'm going the right way here. In the brief time I have with you, the summary of my presentation is I want to give a little history of the ozone designation in Wisconsin. I'm going to go very fast on this because the results are remarkable. There's incredible improvement when we go through these slides in terms of what's happened in Wisconsin over the years in terms of ozone regulation. I'm going to talk a little bit about predictions about what's going to happen on the non-attainment areas in Wisconsin under the new ozone standard. We heard from Rob a little bit on the Midwest. I'm going to hone in on a couple maps in Wisconsin. And then I want to give a little bit of an overview of the permitting requirements for major sources in non-attainment areas. And then finally give a little summary of my view of what the practical implications of this new ozone standard is. So a history of ozone. I want to start with a quotation by Mark Twain. The past may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And I think it applies really when we look at the history of improvement, even though we're starting with less stringent standards in Wisconsin back in 1979, when we talked about 120 parts per billion 1 hour standard. We're now, of course, ratcheting that out over the years from an 85 part per billion standard now to a current, after a 75 part per billion standard, and also now to a 70 part per billion standard. And in Wisconsin, and over the years, it's been a remarkable improvement. Even though I represent a lot of businesses, I think a lot of credit has to go to the businesses in Wisconsin in terms of reaching these standards, and I don't think the story gets out well enough for Wisconsin on the improvement of air quality. And there's going to be more challenges than just these brief strides. I won't go into detail because it talks about the history, but with the exception of Sheboygan and a portion of Kenosha County, essentially Wisconsin has met all these standards as they've ratcheted down. And I think even though people will be concerned about the new 70 part per billion standard, the challenges it will create, I think we've got a good track history here in Wisconsin of Wisconsin business coming to the table when there's a mandatory requirement and figuring out how to meet those requirements. I mean, the technology that has been driven since 1979 to today is astronomical in terms of methods to reduce ozone, VOCs, NOx emissions. Lots of regulations drive technology, and this is no exception here in terms of these rules, and they're going to be challenging, but I think the history of attainment and non-attainment in Wisconsin, I think, supports a good roadmap for, even though we have challenges, what's going to happen here in the future. So let's talk about what's going to potentially happen in Wisconsin, given some of these standards. And I will start with a quote from Yogi Berra: "When I make predictions, I don't want to make the wrong mistake when I make these predictions, but I think we have a pretty good roadmap of what's going to happen in Wisconsin, looking at two different scenarios in terms of data. This map depicts the most recent data, which is not all quality assured yet, but it shows the most recent data available from 2013 to 2015, and it would estimate that if this holds true, if you fast forward now to 2017, we'll probably have non-attainment areas in the areas that are designated on this map, but they will be marginal non-attainment, which is the least stringent non-attainment area. I'll show you non-attainment requirement under the Clean Air Act. I'll show you, some of the things that are triggered. But if this holds true, we'll have some non-attainment areas, but there'll be marginal non-attainment, and I'll tell you what that means for businesses. Now, I guess we don't have another map, but I do have another. I thought I had another map in here, but it did show some predictions for counties based upon the most recent quality assured data, which was 2012 through 2014, and that would have expanded the non-attainment areas probably in about 5 or 6 more counties, and 1 or 2 of those might have even been moderate non-attainment if you used that 2012, 2014 data to make predictions about what's going to be non-attainment in 2017. Everybody following me? I mean, what's going to happen is we're going to have more data, and Rob and Arlene have talked about that, and technically, some opportunities for more improvement depending upon what happens to, mobile sources and also the naturally occurring challenges that we have in this area and what happens with VW diesels in terms of what they come back with some compliance, right? I mean, this all could have some implications for how we're going to meet these non-attainment designations by 2017. But having said all of this, I think for Wisconsin, the best predictors indicate by 2017 we'll probably have those counties along, the Lake Michigan and inward into modestly that will be marginal non-attainment based upon the most recent data. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the overview of permitting requirements for major sources in non-attainment areas. Now, if anybody has read the Clean Air Act, it is mind-numbing. And I'm standing up here, I want to kind of consolidate in 5 minutes what the requirements are for major sources in non-attainment areas. It is very, very challenging. And again, here I go again quoting Mark Twain. He said this when he was talking about the dictionary: "I've studied it often, but never could discover the plot." And I sort of feel that way sometimes about the Clean Air Act. You immerse yourself in this language, and you read the legislative history, and you read the rules. It's mind-numbing. In my judgment, it's probably one of the most complex areas that I practice in the area that I've been in environmental energy law. Clean Air Act areas are very challenging, and it's a great opportunity for people in education here to find jobs, because it is going to continue to be challenging with the Clean Power Plan things we heard. So having said that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the requirements are when you have non-attainment areas and you have major sources. Now, the fact of the matter is, this only applies to major sources. If we're talking about businesses, for marginal non-attainment areas, the new source would have to have a potential to emit more than 100 tons of NOx or VOC emissions. Those are very, very large sources. So when you hear the concern in the business community about what this is going to mean for conducting business, this only applies to the very, very largest of sources. Now, it's not only implications for new sources, but if you have an existing source that is going to modify their operations, and they have a potential to emit from that modification more than 40 tons of VOCs or NOx, that triggers, if you're in a non-attainment area, too, some of the things I'm talking about. Now, I mention that is because there are ways around for the business community to avoid these issues, and I'm going to talk about a little bit. But again, the point of this discussion, trying to summarize the mind-numbing provisions of the Clean Air Act, this only applies to very, very large sources of VOCs and NOx. And if I'm right in my predictions based upon the data that all of our non-attainment areas, which will be relatively few, are going to be marginal and not more severe non-attainment, those standards that I applied are going to apply to major sources. Have to have a potential to emit more than 100 tons, or if you're modifying an existing source, has to be more than 40 tons, and that's potential to emit. Okay? So, if we're true for Wisconsin, and we're only going to be marginal non-attainment, this slide I have up here is probably not going to apply for any more new regulations that already exist. They're the reasonably available control technology standards. Normally, if you are marginal non-attainment, there are not going to be new what are called RAC standards, but we have existing standards that apply to existing businesses that are legacies from all of our earlier non-attainment designations that cannot be lessened, because under the Clean Air Act, you cannot you can't remove restrictions that have already occurred. I'm paraphrasing a provision, it's called anti-backsliding. So these RAC standards will stay in place for those 20 counties for VOCs and about 8 counties, I think, for NOx emissions where there are these reasonable available control technology standards, but they're already in existence. The non-attainment designation is not going to change that if it stays as a marginal non-attainment area. There will not be a requirement for new RAC standards. Everybody following me on that? So you'll hear a lot of discussion about that. That's the fact, but it is important to see what happens in the next series of 2 years, because if we become a moderate non-attainment, which is a step more stringent because of what the numbers come back at, we could have some additional of these RAC requirements, but if it turns out to be moderate, those won't require it. Now, what happens on non-attainment for new source review? Again, these are a potential to emit more than 100 tons for a new source, or if you're modifying an existing source, more than 40 tons. The main issues are the requirements for putting on emission controls and the need for offsets. As a practical matter, those are the two biggest significant issues for stationary sources. If you are a major source in a non-attainment area, you have special emission requirements and special offset requirements, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit. Now this slide, again, I want to show you, it shows what are the major sources categories depending upon the category of non-attainment. See that? And you see where marginal is? It's a potential to emit of 100 for new sources, and for major modifications, it's 40. If we get down to serious, which nobody thinks that's going to happen, you can see how that category is ratcheted down. And we were in, 10 years ago, in serious non-attainment areas where these major sources, for new sources and major modifications, they were capturing a larger web of facilities because the threshold is smaller because it's a bigger problem. But again, for the new designation at 70 parts per billion, if it's marginal, it's probably going to be 100 tons and 40 tons for major modifications. So really going to be a relatively small group of a subset of emission categories. Emission controls. If you are triggering changes by new source, by putting in a new source and you're a major, or modifying an existing source, you have to meet very stringent emission controls. It goes by the acronym LAIR, which is lowest available emission reductions available, and usually the way this is set up, you look at the 13 highest performing facilities in a certain sector, or this may be modified a little bit by some regional designations as we get into implementation and seeing if we're going to have regional approaches here. But there are more stringent limitations that apply if you're a major source and you're going to site a new facility or you're going to modify an existing facility. You have to meet these standards, which are more stringent than would be if you're not a major source. Okay? There's a compliance review. I won't spend too much time on that, but you have to make a demonstration that all your facilities are in compliance. It's a regulatory requirement when you get major source permitting under a non-attainment designation. Now, offset requirements I want to spend a little time on because these could potentially be challenging. Anybody familiar with offset requirements? Maybe show a raise of the hands. Okay, a few of you. And this again only applies to major sources. If you want to put in a new major sources, let's say we're going to be in a marginal non-attainment area. And this is going to have to fast forward a couple years because we got to see what happens in 2017, and then the state's going to have to put in their implementation plan, which will take another 2 or 3 years. But the important issue here is if you're going to increase emissions and you're a major source, you have to go find reductions for every unit of emissions you want to increase for NOx or VOCs, either by demonstrating reductions in your current processes or by going out and actually buying offset credits from qualified facilities who've had a certification from the Department of Natural Resources in their permits that they've actually reduced VOC emissions and they're quantified. And believe it or not, 10 years ago, there was a vigorous market for offset credits. When we were severe non-attainment in Wisconsin, I represented sources that were major sources that needed to increase their emissions because they're putting new processes in. And we actually went to the Department of Natural Resources, found out who had certified reductions in those non-attainment areas. And once you find out who had the certified reductions, you actually went and talked to them and you negotiated a price to get those offset requirements. Everybody following me? I mean, that's a new requirement that's going to apply to non-attainment sources that are major under this categorization. And the challenge here is, except for Kenosha, Sheboygan, and a portion of Kenosha, nobody really had to be worried about offset credits for quite a while. And so people probably weren't monitoring sources of reductions that have occurred. This is going to be very important now. There may be some value for these offset credits going forward, and I think this is an important issue that people need to start thinking about if you're in the business of creating VOC emissions and actually putting in best available control technology on reducing them more than you're required to reduce them. You'll actually get some certified reduction credits that could be valuable for major sources. Now, the last thing I want to say is, I mentioned to this for implications of business, this applies to major sources. These are large sources, potential to emit of 100 tons for new sources, or modifications, potential to emit of 40 tons. There is a very relatively straightforward way to avoid the major source treatment by becoming a synthetic miner. Does anybody know what a synthetic miner is? Raise your hand. A few of you do. Okay. You can actually sit down and talk to the Department of Natural Resources, even if you have a greater potential to emit than 100 tons, and you would otherwise be a major source, or if you're going to modify, you'd have a potential to emit of more than 40 tons, you can actually sit down with the Department of Natural Resources and agree to restrictions in your permit that would guarantee your actual emissions would never be greater than those potentials to emit, even if your calculations were on a maximum 24/7 operation, you have a potential to emit more than those amounts. If you limit your emissions by permit, you can become what's called a synthetic miner, and you can avoid all these offset requirements and these layer control requirements. And it's something that major sources frequently will do to avoid these regulations. So having said all of this, you hear a lot in the trade press about the negative implications on bringing the ozone standard down. Listen, I make a living by representing industry, and I think there are challenges. But I think the fact of the matter is we've shown, I think, extraordinary history of over time meeting these ozone requirements when they come into place. And yes, 70 parts is going to be parts per billion is going to be another 5 parts per billion less than what we're used to. But I think it's going to be a marginal non-attainment area. And yes, there's all kinds of challenges that we heard from Arlene and Rob about naturally occurring background information and the big play that mobile sources and the fact that a lot of this is coming in from interstate sources. But I think there are mechanisms that exist that business can use to really navigate through this. And I think, in my judgment, we're going to continue to experience healthy environment and preserving what is all great about the state of Wisconsin. Thank you.